Now, there are many great JRPGs out there, so many in fact that playing every single one of them would simply be impossible. However, every now and then on my journey through this genre, a title will stick out to me as something truly unique unlike any other, with one of those titles being today's topic, Shadow Hearts. This game back in 2001 on the PlayStation 2 managed to do something different. Whilst most series were focusing on bigger budgets, ambitious scopes and cinematic cutscenes, Shadow Hearts stood out with how it attempted something JRPGs had never really pulled off before, that being combining turn-based gameplay with Lovecraftian horror, alongside its setting taking place in the early 1900s, having its own spin on real-world events and locations, combining them with the supernatural. The game was developed mostly by ex-Square staff members who formed the company Saknov, which is a story that shares a lot in common with Monolith Soft. During this time, the newly formed Square Enix was pushing hard for Final Fantasy and wasn't as interested in greenlighting new projects like it was during the PlayStation 1 generation. What this resulted in was a lot of veterans at the company moving on to create their own development teams and series. Shadow Hearts starts the player off with a pretty amusing hook. In the year 1913, after seeing a headline for a priest being brutally murdered and his daughter going missing ever since, we enter a train that's being hijacked by a lone gentleman that manages to effortlessly kill all the guards on board. It's not until Yore, the main protagonist, arrives that he's actually challenged to a real fight. I love this opening, it manages to be equally serious and over the top at the same time. Sure, this CGI hasn't aged all that well, but it still has its charm. After defeating the mysterious man on the train roof that goes by Roger Bacon, you rescue the girl he was looking for and escape. And they get to know one another. Turns out Yuri has some of his own inner demons plaguing his mind, and that the girl goes by Alice Elliot. Hey, that's my name, she's also somehow tied up in all this. It doesn't take long until they're contacted by a mysterious voice telling them where to go next, and the two set out alongside the player to piece together just what on earth is even going on here. The game's actual narrative goes in all kinds of directions. You start off in China and end up travelling all across the world, hitting up new party members and getting tied into many conflicts along the way, like political disputes between Japan invading Shanghai. I mean, it's not every day you see a Japanese role-playing game paint Japan in a negative light like this one. As a Trails fan, it's sort of refreshing to see a title like this one focus more on individuals standing up against their country if it means doing what's right. I think that's a theme most of us can agree on despite the sensitive subject matter is tackled very well here. But that's not all there is to Shadow Hearts' narrative, it's also a horror game, and as such I wouldn't particularly say it's outright scary, but how it goes about using the aesthetic still looks amazing with its character designs and pre-rendered fixed backgrounds. Look, it's par for the course in these videos for me to at least mention them, and I will be remiss not to bring up how these backgrounds are pulled off here. This is a very healthy obsession of mine, I swear. Anyway, this game delivers with its beautifully detailed environments that feel dark and dilapidated. It's revitalizing, seeing a JRPG tackle less of a fantasy look and instead focusing more on realism, giving its own spin on both Eastern and Western environments built during the early 1900s. You could quite easily, despite the horror aesthetic, get lost in these backgrounds that feel like a canvas designed by the developers to truly make these locations feel larger than life. It easily gets the certified Elliot-Cloud fixed camera seal of approval stamp. If you're obsessed with this lost art that only existed through the interactive medium of video games like I am, you'll definitely want to give Shadow Hearts a shot for how they're pulled off alone here. Where was we again? Oh yeah, the game's narrative. Shadow Hearts might not be outright scary, but it can be pretty disturbing at times. Some scenes even tackle body horror, which has always been something that gets to me with the genre personally. Just the concept alone I kind of find freaky and media. Speaking of, there's also its enemy designs that feel ripped right out of H.P. Lovecraft or that one film called The Fly. Although some of them, like these upside down floating bodies, do look a bit too goofy when it comes to taking them seriously. And to be fair, Shadow Hearts, despite its overall more serious tone, also knows how to have a sense of humour. Yuri in particular is quite unconventional for a game like this, making some pretty risky jokes at first but slowly maturing throughout the events of this title. Also, on the topic of Shadow Hearts humour, one part that stood out to me is when talking to the real Roger Bacon, he'll have the party member name screen pop up like it has for every other character that joins you. But instead, he'll amusingly call out the screen transition, saying how he already had his own name. It's a very charming fourth wall break and it's one I've never seen done before. Roger alongside Kodelka herself, who's an important character to the narrative, are actually from a PlayStation 1 title called, well, Kodelka. I've not yet played the game myself, but Shadow Hearts is actually based in the same universe, it's just that you can play either title in any order, since these stories take place independently from one another. Overall, I found myself enjoying the narrative of Shadow Hearts. It's nothing too deep, but feels like one on its own and knows when to change things with its multiple arcs as well as locations to mix things up before they start to feel stale. Moving on to this game's combat, and I've got to say, this is aged remarkably well for a JRPG from 2001. Remember when everyone was raving about the timed inputs of Clair Obscur? Well, Shadow Hearts predates that concept by a long shot with its centralized wheel spin mechanic. It's fairly intuitive. Whenever you want to perform an action, be it healing, buffing or attacking, this dial will start to turn and you have to hit the coloured sectors in order to be able to perform the move. Miss them and you'll lose that party member's turn, which at later points in the game can mean the difference between life and death. However, if you can manage to hit all the coloured segments and even touch the darker lines, you'll deal a full-length combo, dishing out some strong attacks in turn. This mechanic very quickly becomes a high-risk, high-reward concept. Its reliance on the player's performance actually creates a good bit of tension, which made me feel more invested in fights opposed to just spamming the best attack which does the most amount of damage. And I mean, the game is just obsessed with its wheel idea. You'll need to do it to progress through story sections, and in shops you can even use it to barter with, rewarding the player with discounts when spun right and even selling items for more than they're worth. This really is the definition of spin to win, and I'm all for it. Also, on the topic of shopping, I need to mention how Shadow Hearts back in 2001 had the option to auto-equip your strongest item at any time. This incredible quality of life feature is something even modern JRPGs today are only now starting to implement, since folks like me very much find it tedious to stare at all these items comparing which one is the strongest. Alright, brief tangent over, I just felt like this was worth complimenting in the review. Each party member in Shadow Hearts has their own unique roles that you'd expect from a turn-based RPG, such as Alice healing and Yushen acting as a black mage, but the protagonist, Yura, has the ability to transform into a literal monster. It's a bit similar to Demon Summoning in Shin Megami Tensei if you're familiar with that title. The player can collect these creatures, and by spending SP in battle, Yuri can change his moveset or role to pretty much anything. And it's here where my first sort of complaint arises for the combat in Shadow Hearts. See, each character has HP and mana, which is self-explanatory, however there's also SP, which stands for sanity points. Whilst I do really commend the developers for incorporating this concept in the game, it is a clever attempt at RPGifying the sanity gauge. The problem it runs into is that this meter can be far too punishing in boss fights. Allow me to explain. So in regular encounters, your SP will likely never run out since it fills up after a battle and enemies typically die within just 3 turns. However, in longer combat sections like with bosses, it's very likely to deplete. And well, when this happens, you pretty much lose all control of whichever party member that runs out of sanity points. They start acting at random, attacking teammates, wasting items, and worst of all, even healing the boss. This mechanic can be absolutely terrifying, not to mention the music doesn't help that plays whenever this happens. Shadow Hearts combat in the beginning is fairly easy and follows a nice gradual difficulty curve, but it gets much more challenging after a certain point. Now, there is a way around this sanity concept. You can use SP items to replenish the meter, but it wastes a turn, not to mention enemies will also use attacks that reduce SP, so sometimes it can sort of just happen. A part of me in some ways does like this mechanic, and I know Shadow Hearts had a few sequels, so I'm hoping it gets more refined later on in this series. However, in the first entry, it can and will make for some frustrating moments, and that's why it's getting a critique from me. I guess a few other small nitpicks I have towards this title as well is whilst its story does start off strong, it kinda just turns into the classic JRPG staple trope of the party having to kill God in the end. Which was a bit of a shame since I like this world and its characters, it's just that they stop receiving developments after their arcs are finished and sort of just hang about, not really doing much by the end. I get that a lot of JRPGs run into this pacing issue, which is probably why it doesn't faze me much nowadays, but at the very least I did enjoy each of the party members here, specifically Yuri and Alice. Yuri matures a lot in this game's story, from being someone who's afraid of who he is, spouting jokes and being generally hot-headed. And thanks to Alice, he changes, learning to accept his past mistakes as a kid, with him being comfortable transforming using his powers for good and not giving in to them. If you like the part in Disc 3 of Final Fantasy VII that tackles Cloud's character and how Tifa is able to bring out the best in him, then you'll like how Shadow Hearts pulls off a similar thing here. This title definitely takes much inspiration from FF7. On a few miscellaneous notes, the soundtrack in Shadow Hearts is quite experimental. It doesn't include the kind of melodies that you typically associate with the genre, having harrowing vocals mixed in with violins and heavy basses. It sounds bizarre because it is, and even a bit scary, but this all somehow manages to harmonize really nicely, as if the game itself is trying to motivate the player to push through all these twisted enemies and terrifying risks like losing SP. But then to contrast its horror tone, the composer Yoshitaka Hirota, who did the music for Xenogears and Chrono Trigger, also blends in more upbeat melodies inspired by many of the areas you explore, like Chinese synths and flutes when exploring Shanghai. The soundtrack here very much deserves to be commended. There's nothing quite like it, not only in JRPGs but when it comes to gaming in general. But unfortunately, despite my modern day more positive outlook on Shadow Hearts, critics back in 2001 weren't as kind to it. On top of that, the game underperformed both in Japan and in the West, selling merely above 110,000 copies worldwide. Ouch, that's not barely anything, especially considering the system's user base and speciality of releasing some of the best JRPGs of all time on it. Critics mocked how graphically the game was lacking when compared to the absolute titan that was Final Fantasy X at the time. Which I sorta get, but to be fair, its art style has aged rather well in some instances, and as one of the few gothic horror JRPGs out there, it's still quite visually interesting when looking at the title today. But that just wasn't enough to win people over back in 2001, I guess. And to throw these critics a bone for a moment, if you was a gamer looking for a JRPG to play on your brand new PS2 with limited internet access, and was in a shop having to pick between Shadow Hearts, a weird looking title with some pretty lackluster box art, or you know, Final Fantasy, a series that was at its peak during the PS1 and practically introduced the genre over in the West, I can understand in retrospect what decision most people would have made here. Simply put, this release unfortunately couldn't compete with more graphically complex titles on the machine. But when looking back on Shadow Hearts today, it very much deserves a second chance, and to anyone who likes this genre, it comes with a wholehearted recommendation from me, especially since I love the horror genre, so seeing the two come together is truly a sight to behold. It would seem like this game's developers still have a soft spot for these types of titles, since in 2022 they kickstarted a spiritual successor to Shadow Hearts called Pennyblood, and it looks very promising. Why didn't nobody tell me about this game? Thankfully it got funded and even has a few trailers floating about. I'm very much looking forward to playing this hopefully one day, but for now I still have Shadow Hearts sequels and predecessors to get through in the meantime. If you managed to reach the end of this video, let me just say thank you so much for watching. Do you have any memories of this forgotten classic? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Any feedback or support is always appreciated. Take care and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.